Hey there. Welcome back, friend. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. Wherever you happen to be right now, you've come to exactly the right place. Maybe you're already under the blankets, the weight of them settling over you. Maybe you're sunk into a soft chair with one lamp glowing low in the corner. Maybe you have just turned everything else off, and this is the last small sound you will let into your evening. However you have arrived, you can stop now. There is nowhere else you need to be for the next little while. There is nothing you need to do. You can let the day go. So let me tell you a story. Picture a house. A tall, narrow house on a quiet street in a great city, sometime in the long reign of Queen Victoria. It is the kind of house with a polished front door and a heavy brass knocker, with thick curtains pulled against the cold, with a faint amber glow of gaslight leaking from the lower windows out onto the wet pavement. From the street in the dark it looks like one single warm world, one family, one home, one light against the night. But it is not one world at all. It is many worlds, stacked carefully one on top of another, and the higher you climb inside that house, the further you travel from the people who actually own it. Down on the ground floor are the grand rooms, the rooms made for being seen, the drawing room with its polished piano, the dining room with its long table and its quiet glint of silver. Up a flight, the family bedrooms, where the master and mistress of the house are sleeping now behind closed doors, in deep beds, in warmth they never have to think about. And then up again, and up once more, past the comfortable floors, past the carpets that grow thinner with every landing, all the way to the very top of the house, where the ceilings slope and the air is colder and the windows are smaller. And there, at the summit of all that grandeur, is a small, plain, firelit room. And here is the thing that I think will genuinely surprise you tonight. In that little room at the top of the house, above the silver and the velvet and the sleeping parents, there is a woman who is just beginning to stir in the dark. She is the most important person in a wealthy child's entire life. She is the first face that child sees in the morning, and the last face they see at night. She is the one who knows which foods they hate, which dreams frighten them, which songs send them to sleep. She knows them better than their own mother does, better, in some houses, than anyone alive. And she is not family. She is paid to be there. She can be given her notice and sent away with a single conversation, a folded reference, and a trunk carried down the back stairs. And the child who loves her more than anyone in the world would have no say in it at all, would not even be told until she was already gone. That is the strange, tender, quietly heartbreaking world we're going to step inside tonight. The hidden world at the top of the Victorian house, the world of the nanny. Now, before we climb those stairs together, let me say one small thing. If this is the kind of slow, gentle history that makes your evenings feel a little softer and a little richer, it would mean a great deal to me if you took a moment to subscribe and leave a like. This is Sleep History with Sikandar, and that quiet little gesture is the thing that lets me keep making these long, calm journeys into the past for you. And while you are here, drop a comment and tell me something. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? And what is the weather doing outside your window? I love reading those. It makes the whole thing feel less like talking into the dark and more like sitting in a room full of friends who simply cannot see each other. There, that is done. So now dim those lights if you have not already. Let the room go soft and quiet around you. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding all day. Take one slow breath in and let it out, and let the modern world fall away behind you like a coat slipping from your shoulders, and let us climb the stairs. It is the very early morning, long before dawn, the hour when even a busy city holds its breath, when the streets are emptied of carriages and the only sound is the occasional far-off clop of a single horse, or the soft hiss of rain that has been falling steadily since midnight. Inside the house, everything is still. The fires in the grand rooms have burned down to grey ash and a few dull red embers. The clocks tick in the darkness, each in its own room, slightly out of step with one another, so that the whole house seems to murmur quietly to itself. The family sleeps, the master and the mistress behind their heavy door. The household is silent, but not everyone in this house is asleep. Come up the back stairs with me. Not the wide front staircase with its polished banister and its turned spindles, the one the family uses, the one a visitor would be led up. No, we are taking the other stairs, the narrow ones, the plain wooden ones tucked away behind a discreet door, the ones the family is not really meant to see and rarely ever uses. These are the servant stairs, and they run like a hidden spine through the whole body of the house, from the cold stone kitchens in the basement all the way up to the attics under the roof. The treads are bare. They creak in particular places, and the people who climb them every day learn exactly where, and learn to step around the worst of it without thinking. Up we go. The air grows cooler with every floor. The smell changes too from the beeswax and faint cigar smoke of the grand rooms below to something plainer the higher we climb. Cold plaster, tallow, coal smoke. The clean, slightly bleak smell of the top of the house. And then we reach the last landing. A low door. A line of warm light glowing softly underneath it. And on the other side of that door the nursery is already awake. This is where the children of the house live. Not visit. Live. It is easy to misunderstand this, so let me say it plainly, because it is one of those facts that quietly rearranges everything else. In a great many well-off Victorian families, the children did not live with their parents in any sense we would recognise today. They lived up here, at the top of the house, in a set of rooms set aside entirely for them, with their own fire and their own furniture and their own small world of rules. They ate up here, they slept up here, they played, and were washed and were dressed, and learned their first lessons up here. The parents were somewhere below, living their own separate adult lives in their own separate part of the house. And the staircase between them was not just wood and plaster, it was a kind of border between two countries. I find that genuinely strange to sit with. A child and its mother, under the same roof, sometimes only 2 floors apart, and yet living almost like neighbours rather than like family, passing whole days without truly being in the same room. And the reason for it, when you look at it closely, tells you a great deal about how that world thought. The nursery was placed at the top of the house on purpose. Partly it was practical. Children are loud. Children cry in the night and thunder up and down on small feet and make the kind of mess and noise that a refined adult household did not want spilling into its quiet, ordered, grown-up rooms. Putting the nursery high up, behind doors and upstairs, kept all of that sealed safely away from the dinner parties and the drawing-room conversations down below. But it was more than practical. It reflected a whole idea about childhood itself. The idea that children were not quite finished people yet, that they were something to be raised in a separate place, by separate hands, and produced downstairs now and then, clean and brushed and on their best behaviour, to be looked at and admired and then sent back up again. Out of sight, out of the way, up where they belonged. And it was here, in this high, sealed-off little kingdom, that the nanny ruled. Let me show you the room itself, because the warm light under that door has been waiting for us, and I want you to see what the children saw when they opened their eyes. It is not grand. That is the first thing. After all the velvet and polish lower down, the nursery is almost plain. The walls are simple. The floor is bare boards, with perhaps a worn rug laid down in front of the hearth where the children sit. There is a guard around the fire, a sturdy metal screen, because the open coal fire is the warm beating heart of this whole floor, and also the most dangerous thing in it. And keeping small hands away from it is one of the first laws of the nursery. The fire is burning now, low and steady and orange, and it throws a soft, moving light across the ceiling and fills the room with a gentle, constant warmth that the rest of the upper floors simply do not have. There is the smell of it too, coal smoke and warm milk and clean linen, and underneath all of it something I can only call the smell of small children sleeping. If you have ever stood in a quiet room where a child is sleeping, you know exactly the smell I mean, and you know that no words quite catch it. A clock ticks softly on the mantelpiece. Outside, beyond the small high window, the rain keeps up its steady, patient whisper against the glass. And in the corner, a single candle, or perhaps a small oil lamp, casts its yellow circle of light, because down below the house may be fitted with the modern marvel of gas. But up here, in the nursery, the old soft light of a flame is often still the rule. Safer, some thought, around children, gentler on their eyes, and so the room glows, the way rooms have glowed for centuries, in firelight and candlelight, while the 19th century hums along somewhere far beneath it. And moving quietly through that warm, low light, already dressed, already awake while the whole city sleeps, is the woman we came up here to meet. She has been awake for a while now. She rose in the cold and the dark before anyone. It was the way she did every single morning. Her small adjoining room was tucked right against the children's. She was so close that she could hear them breathing through the wall. A single cry in the night reached her before it could ever reach a parent 2 floors down. There is a reason for that nearness, and we will come to it. For now, simply notice it. She does not sleep near the people who pay her. She sleeps near the people she cares for. The arrangement of the whole house is built around that one quiet fact. She moves softly so as not to wake the children before it is time. She kneels at the hearth and coaxes the fire higher, building the warmth the room will need for small bodies climbing out of bed. She sets out the things the morning will require. She works in the kind of practiced silence that comes only from doing the same gentle tasks, in the same order, in the same room, thousands and thousands of times. This is not exciting work. It is not glamorous, but there is a steadiness to it, a quiet competence that I find genuinely moving to picture. A whole sleeping household, and one woman awake in the dark at the top of it, warming a room so that children who are not her own will wake into comfort. Who is she? Where did she come from? How did she end up here, at the top of a stranger's house, holding the most important place in a child's life and the least secure place in the household all at once? We will learn all of that slowly as the night goes on. We will learn what her days were truly like, and what power she held and what it cost her. We will learn why a grown man, decades later, one of the most famous men of his age, would keep a portrait of his old nanny on the wall until the day he died. And we'll learn the harder things too, the loneliness folded into this life, the strange position of a woman who belonged to a family without ever being family, the children she would raise and love and then one day have to leave. But none of that has happened yet. For now it is simply early, and it is dark, and it is warm. The fire is climbing, the rain is steady on the glass, the clock is ticking softly on the mantel, and in their small beds in the room next door the children of the house are still sleeping, still wrapped in dreams, with no idea yet that the day has begun. The woman at the hearth straightens up and brushes the coal dust from her apron and turns toward the door of the night nursery where they sleep. And that quiet room, with its little beds and its sleeping children, and its first grey hint of a morning that has not yet come, is exactly where we are going next. So let us follow her through the low connecting door, and into the room where the children sleep. This is the night nursery. That was the name for it, and it is worth holding on to because it tells you something about how carefully this world was divided. A wealthy Victorian nursery was very often not one room, but two. There was the night nursery, which is this one, the bedroom, the quiet dark room where the children slept. And there was the day nursery next door, the bright busy room where everything else in their small lives happened. Sleeping and waking, resting and playing, the whole of childhood neatly sorted into two adjoining rooms at the top of the house, and a woman moving back and forth between them like a tide. The night nursery is dim and warm. A low fire breathes in the grate behind its guard, just enough to keep the chill of the upper floors from creeping in. There are several small beds, or perhaps cots for the littlest ones, and narrow beds for the older children, lined up neatly along the walls, and in them the children are sleeping. You can hear them. The soft, even sound of small breathing, 4 or 5 different rhythms overlapping in the dark. One child has thrown an arm out across the blanket. Another has burrowed down so far that only a tuft of hair shows above the covers. They sleep the way only children can sleep, completely, heavily, as though sleep were a place they had gone to rather than a thing they were doing. The nanny stands in the doorway for a moment and simply looks at them. I want you to sit with that small picture, because there is more in it than there first appears. This woman is, in this moment, doing exactly what a mother might do. Standing in the dark, watching over sleeping children, listening to their breath, ready to cross the room in an instant if one of them stirs or cries. Every tender thing we associate with a mother in the night she is doing. The watching, the waiting, the being there. And these are not her children. She did not give birth to them. In the strict accounting of that household, they are not hers in any way at all. And yet here she is, the one awake in the dark, the one keeping the watch. I find that quietly remarkable, and we're going to come back to it many times before the night is through. But it is not quite time to wake them, not yet, so let us leave them sleeping and step back through the connecting door into the other room, the bright one, the heart of it all, the day nursery. If the night nursery is for sleeping, the day nursery is for living, and you can see that the moment you walk in. This is the room where the children spend almost all their waking hours. It is warmer and busier and more cluttered than the room next door. The fire here is built up higher, because this is where small bodies will be sitting on the rug and playing on the floor through the long hours of the day. There's a sturdy table in the middle of the room, scrubbed and plain, where the children will eat their meals and later bend over their first letters and sums. There are little chairs. There is a tall guard around the hearth, taller than a child, because in a room full of small children and an open coal fire, that guard is quite literally the line between an ordinary day and a tragedy, and everyone who worked in a nursery knew it. And there are the things that make a nursery, the toys. Let me show them to you, because Victorian nursery toys are their own quiet little window into that whole vanished world. Over in the corner there is very likely a rocking horse. A real one, large and solid, carved from wood and painted dapple grey, with a real horsehair mane and tail, glass eyes, and a proper little saddle. A rocking horse was a serious object in a well-off nursery, sometimes handed down from older children to younger, sometimes from one whole generation to the next, ridden by a father when he was small and now by his own son. There's a doll's house, perhaps a tall one, a miniature of exactly the kind of grand house the children themselves live in, complete with tiny furniture and tiny rooms, so that a child sitting on the nursery floor could play at running a household in miniature long before they would ever run one for real. There are dolls with delicate china faces. There are tin soldiers, painted and lined up in their regiments. There are picture books and a spinning top and a box of bricks. And then, on a shelf perhaps a little apart from the others, there is one particular toy that I have to tell you about, because it surprised me when I first learned the truth of it. It is a Noah's Ark, a wooden ark with a little painted Noah, and pairs of carved wooden animals to be marched up the ramp 2 by 2. It looks, at first glance, like any other toy. But in a great many strict Victorian households, the Noah's Ark was not just any other toy at all, it was the Sunday toy. In fact, in the most religious homes, it was very often the only toy a child was permitted to touch on a Sunday. The whole rest of the week, the other toys came out. The soldiers, the dolls, the spinning top, the bricks. But on the Sabbath, all of those were put quietly away, because play for its own sake was thought unsuitable for the Lord's Day. And the one exception, the single plaything allowed, was the ark, because it told a story straight out of the Bible. And so, on Sunday after Sunday, a child would sit on the nursery floor and march the same wooden animals up the same little ramp, 2 by 2, not because it was the most exciting toy in the room, but because it was the only one they were allowed. Think about that for a moment. A child's week divided so completely that even their toys observed the Sabbath. The ordinary playthings sleeping in their cupboard, and the holy ark alone on the floor, and a small child quietly learning, without anyone ever quite explaining it, that the days of the week had different rules, and that even joy was something to be measured out carefully. There is something in that I find both a little sad and strangely tender. A whole world view, taught not with a lecture but with a toy. This was the day nursery. This was the room where a Victorian childhood actually unfolded, hour by hour, behind its tall fireguard, under the soft yellow light of a lamp, far above the grand life of the house below. And the woman who ran it ran everything in it. She decided when the children woke and when they slept. She decided what they wore and what they ate and when. She decided what was played with and what was put away, who had been good and who had been naughty, when it was time for fresh air and when it was time for rest. Within these 2 rooms her word was simply the law, not the mother's word, hers. The mother might give a general instruction now and then, might express a wish about this or that, but the moment-to-moment governing of these children, the 1,000 small decisions that actually make up a day, all of that belonged to the nanny, and to the nanny alone. And this is where her position starts to become genuinely strange and genuinely interesting, and I want to be careful to get it right, because it sits at the very centre of who she was. She had enormous power, and she had almost no security. Inside this nursery, she was a kind of monarch. But step outside the nursery door, go down those narrow back stairs into the rest of the household, and her standing becomes one of the most peculiar and lonely in the entire house. Because the nanny did not really belong anywhere. She was not one of the family. That much was absolutely clear, and it was never, ever forgotten. She ate apart from them. She did not sit in their drawing room as an equal. She was staff. She was paid. But she was also not quite one of the servants. Not in the ordinary sense. She did not scrub the front steps or carry the coal or wait at the dinner table. She ranked above the housemaids and the kitchen maids. She was what was called an upper servant, one of the small handful of senior staff, and she often held herself a little apart from the others below stairs, just as they, in turn, held themselves apart from her. So picture where that leaves her, above the servants, but below the family. Trusted with the most precious thing the household owns, its children, and yet never allowed to forget that those children are not hers. Living in the family's home, eating the family's food, loving the family's children, and belonging to none of it. There is a word that historians sometimes use for this position. They call it a kind of limbo, a person suspended between two worlds, fully part of neither. And I think that single fact, more than any other, is the key that unlocks the whole of this story. Hold on to it. Almost everything tender and almost everything sad about the life of the Victorian nanny grows out of that one strange, in-between place she was made to stand. But all of that is the daylight world, the world of the household below, and we will go down into it soon enough. For now, we're still up here, at the top of the house, in the warm, cluttered day nursery, where the fire is climbing and the rocking horse waits in the corner and the rain still whispers against the small high window. And next door, in the dim, warm dark, the children are beginning to stir. A blanket shifts. A small voice murmurs something out of a dream. The first grey light of the morning is just beginning to press, faint and cold against the glass. The day is about to begin, and the first thing that happens in a nursery, when the children open their eyes, is a ritual as old and as careful as the house itself. That is where we're going now. The nanny moves to the windows first. She draws back the curtains, and the thin grey light of early morning slides into the night nursery, pale and cold, falling across the small beds. She does not fling them open the way you might on a bright summer holiday. She does it gently, letting the light come in slowly, because waking a child is a thing she has learned to do with care. A child dragged too suddenly out of sleep is a child who will be fretful all morning, and she knows this the way she knows everything in this room, from long practice rather than from any book. And then, softly, she wakes them. There is a particular tenderness in how a good nanny woke her charges, and I want to linger on it for just a moment, because it is one of the small daily kindnesses that almost never made it into the history books. A hand resting on a small shoulder, a quiet voice saying the same gentle words it says every morning, the blankets drawn back just enough. One by one the children surface out of sleep, rubbing their eyes, blinking at the grey light, reluctant the way all children everywhere have always been reluctant to leave a warm bed on a cold morning. Some of them are cheerful. One of them, there is always one, is not, and burrows back down and has to be coaxed. And she coaxes. This too is the work, not the grand work of raising the next generation of a great family, the small work, the shoulder, the voice, the patience, repeated every single morning of every single year. And then comes the part of the morning that I suspect would shock a modern child more than anything else in this whole house. The wash. There is no bathroom up here. Let that picture settle for a moment. because it is so easy to forget. No tap to turn, no hot water rushing out on demand. For most of the Victorian period, even in a fine and wealthy house, the nursery had no plumbing of its own at all. What it had instead was a washstand, a piece of furniture, a stand with a marble or wooden top, and on it a large ceramic basin and a tall matching jug, the kind of jug and basin set you might see today in an antique shop and never quite understand the purpose of, and the water in that jug had to be carried up, by hand, all the way up those narrow back stairs, from the depths of the house to the very top, by a servant, every single day. And here is the detail that I find genuinely startling. That water was very often cold. Not always in the kindest and most comfortable homes, where hot water might be carried up for the children. But in a great many households, as a matter of principle, the morning wash was meant to be cold. Bracing, they called it. There was a powerful Victorian belief, especially among the upper classes who were raising sons to one day run an empire, that cold water was good for a child, that it hardened them, that it built character and discipline and moral fibre, that a brisk cold wash in a cold room first thing in the morning was not a hardship to be pitied, but a virtue to be instilled. A soft child, raised only in warmth and comfort, was thought to be a child you were doing no favours at all. And so the day for many a Victorian child began with a flannel and a basin of cold water in a cold room, scrubbed face and neck and hands and ears, whether they liked it or not, and most of them did not like it at all. Think about that the next time you stand in a hot shower on a winter morning, the steam rising around you, and you consider it the bare minimum of a civilized life. For a great many of the most privileged children who ever lived, in some of the grandest houses in the world, the morning began instead with a gasp and a shiver and a cold, wet flannel, administered briskly by a woman who believed, with the full conviction of her age, that she was doing it entirely for their own good. And then the dressing. And here too the modern world simply falls away. There were no easy clothes, no soft elastic, no quick zips, no garments a small child could pull on by themselves in a minute. Victorian children's clothing was an elaborate, layered, complicated affair, and getting a child into it was a real and time-consuming task that the child could not possibly manage alone. There were undergarments, and then more undergarments. There were petticoats, there were little dresses, for in this period, it is worth knowing, very young boys and girls alike were both dressed in skirts and gowns. A little boy was not put into trousers until he was several years old, in a moment that was treated almost as a milestone, a small ceremony of growing up, when he was at last considered old enough to leave behind the petticoats of babyhood. Until then, from a distance, the small children of the nursery would have looked very much alike, a little flock of skirted figures, regardless of whether they were boys or girls, and every button, every tie, every hook, every lace of all those layers was fastened by the nanny or by the girl who worked beneath her. Which brings me to someone I have not yet introduced you to, someone who has in fact already been at work in this house for some time this morning, carrying that very water up the stairs, because the nanny, you see, was very often not alone. In a grand household with several children, the nanny stood at the top of a small staircase of her own, a little hierarchy of nursery staff arranged neatly beneath her. Below her was the nursery maid, and the nursery maid's life is worth pausing on, because if the nanny's position was strange and in between, the nursery maid's was simply hard. She was usually young, sometimes very young indeed, a girl of perhaps 13 or 14, in her first place in service, far from her own family, learning the work from the bottom up, and the bottom was where she lived. It was the nursery maid who did the heavy, dirty, endless tasks that kept the nursery running. She was the one who hauled the coal up all those stairs to keep the nursery fires burning. She was the one who carried the water for the washing, jug after jug, up and down, up and down. She emptied the chamber pots, for remember there was no plumbing, and carried them back down again. She scrubbed the nursery floor. She cleaned the grates and laid the fires and washed the endless small clothes and the linens. She rose earlier than almost anyone, often before the nanny herself. She went to bed later, and in between she was on her feet for nearly the whole of a very long day. It was exhausting work, and she did all of it under the watchful eye of the nanny. The nanny could be kind, remembering her own beginnings, but she could also be fiercely strict. For the nanny, the nursery maid was a pupil to be trained, and the discipline was exacting. The polished, magical nanny remembered with such love was very often standing on the tired young shoulders of a 14-year-old girl. There is something in that I find quietly important to say out loud. The comfort of the nursery, the warm fire and the clean clothes and the carried water, the whole soft cocoon of a privileged childhood did not simply happen. It was carried up the back stairs, one heavy load at a time, by a child not much older than the children she served, whose own childhood had effectively already ended. But for now the water is up, and the fires are lit, and the children are washed and dressed at last, scrubbed and buttoned and laced into their many layers, hair brushed, faces pink from the cold flannel, and they are hungry. Children in the morning always are. And so we come to breakfast. The nursery breakfast, eaten up here at the scrubbed wooden table, was its own small world, quite separate from whatever the grown-ups were eating in their own time downstairs. It was plain food, deliberately so. This was not the rich, varied table of the adult household. Nursery food was simple, wholesome, and more than a little monotonous, governed by the same firm Victorian conviction that had given us the cold wash. Children, it was believed, should not be indulged with rich or fancy or highly flavoured food. Their meals should be nourishing and dull, and plain fare was thought to be good for both the body and the character. And so, at the very centre of the nursery breakfast, morning after morning after morning, sat the great unchanging monument of the Victorian nursery. Porridge, a bowl of plain oatmeal, porridge, often without sugar, sometimes with little milk, eaten at the nursery table under the watchful eye of the nanny, who saw to it that every child finished what was in front of them. There might be bread and butter, there might be milk to drink, but the porridge was the constant, reliable grey heart of the nursery morning. Generations of children grew up on it. A great many of them grew to quietly dread it. Yet a few of them, decades later, would remember the exact taste of that porridge with a complicated mix of distaste and deep, aching fondness. Because that is the thing about the nursery. The thing we will keep circling back to all through this long night. Almost everything about it was plain. The food was plain. The room was plain. The clothes were practical, and the rules were strict, and the water was cold. And yet, for the people who grew up inside it, this small plain world at the top of the house would become, in memory, one of the most powerful and emotional places they had ever known. Not because of the porridge, but because of who was sitting at the head of the table making sure they ate it. The children are fed now. The bowls are cleared. The long day of the nursery stretches ahead, and it runs by rules, by a whole quiet code of order and discipline that governed every hour of it. And that code, and the woman who enforced it, and the strange and total power she held over these small lives, is where we are going next, after breakfast, the nursery quietly settles into the long shape of its day, and the shape of that day is governed by one of the most important words in the whole Victorian world: routine. It is hard, from where we sit now, to fully appreciate how completely the Victorians believed in routine. To us, the word can sound a little dull, a little dreary even. To them it was something close to a moral force. A child raised in routine, they believed, was a child being shaped into a good adult. Order, discipline, regular hours, fixed meals, fixed lessons, fixed naps, fixed walks, fixed bedtimes, the same things happening in the same order at the same time, day after day after day. This was not seen as monotonous or limiting. This was seen as the actual mechanism by which good character was built. Self-control, obedience, patience, the ability to wait, the ability to do what was required without complaint, all of it, they thought, came not from lectures or sermons, but from the quiet, repeated rhythm of a well-ordered day. And the person who held the whole of that routine in her hands, the keeper of the clock and the calendar of childhood, was the nanny. Her day was not improvised. It ran like a small private railway timetable, and the children moved along it from station to station without ever quite seeing the tracks. Wake at this hour, wash at that hour, breakfast at this hour, lessons or play in the day nursery until this hour, the morning airing in the park until that hour, dinner in the middle of the day because the children, like the servants, ate their main meal at midday, not in the evening with the grown-ups, a rest, quiet play, a nursery tea, the hour spent downstairs with the parents, of which we will say much more in a little while. And then, as the day folded itself toward evening, the slow ritual of bedtime, in the same order, in the same room, with the same good nights, every single night. There is something genuinely soothing in picturing it, even now. A child held inside a day that never surprised them. A small life entirely scaffolded by the knowledge of what was coming next and next and next. For many a Victorian child, this steadiness was the deepest comfort of their early years, and even those who later in life chafed against the strictness of it would also often look back and recognize, with something like wonder, how safe that perfect predictable rhythm had made them feel. But of course there is the other side of it, the shadow side, the reason that, in honest histories and honest memoirs, the nursery is not always remembered as a paradise, because that whole great routine, that quietly humming timetable of childhood, was enforced by one woman, in a sealed-off room at the top of a tall house, almost entirely beyond the sight of any other adult in the world. I want you to really sit with that picture for a moment, because everything difficult about this story flows out of it. A wealthy Victorian family had handed over the daily reality of its children to a stranger, not a relative, not a friend, a paid employee, sometimes hired on the strength of a single conversation and a written reference from a previous household. And once that employee was installed up here, in her own kingdom, the parents very largely stepped back. They did not, as a rule, sit in the nursery and watch. They did not check on the lessons. They did not supervise the meals or the baths or the small punishments. They were downstairs leading their adult lives in the firm Victorian belief that to interfere with the nanny's running of the nursery was both bad parenting and bad manners. The nanny had been trusted with the job. The job was hers to do. Step too often into her domain, and you were undermining her authority, which was the very thing that made her able to do her work at all. And so an extraordinary thing was true in many, many wealthy households of the period. The most important adult in a child's life, the person who held that child every day, and shaped that child's character, and decided that child's fate hour by hour, was an adult whose own behaviour was watched by almost no one. Now, in most homes, this was perfectly fine. Most nannies were exactly what they appeared to be: decent, dedicated, often genuinely loving women who took their responsibility with great seriousness. They'd been doing this work for years. They knew children. They knew themselves. They knew the line between firmness and cruelty, and they did not cross it. The children in their care grew up in safety, in real warmth, and in the kind of patient, consistent attention that, by any measure, is the foundation of a good childhood. We must say that very clearly because it is the truth of the great majority of these lives. The Victorian nanny at her best was one of the quietly heroic figures of her century. But here is the harder truth, and it is the one that earns the word dark in our story tonight. When the system worked, it worked beautifully. When it did not work, there was almost no one to know. A nanny who was strict could, behind that nursery door, be very strict indeed. The Victorian period, broadly speaking, did not share our modern instinct that physical punishment of children was something to be avoided. Quite the opposite. A firm hand was thought to be necessary. A child who was naughty was a child who needed correction, and that correction was very often physical. A slap, a smacking, a stinging blow from the back of a hairbrush, a whipping with a small rod. All of these were considered ordinary and appropriate methods of bringing a child into line. They were used by mothers themselves when they used them at all. They were used in schools, they were used in the nursery. None of it, by the standards of that age, was thought to be cruel. The trouble is that the standards of an age are not the same as the temperament of every individual. Once a child was placed inside that sealed-off nursery, they were with a single adult. By the rules of her time, she was permitted to physically discipline that child when necessary. Parents downstairs were strongly discouraged from looking too closely at her methods. The door was open, in some unhappy households, to a level of harshness. It was a harshness that the parents themselves would have been horrified by had they ever truly known. There were nannies in this period, and we know this from the memoirs and letters and remembered childhoods of the people they raised, who were quietly but seriously cruel. Children who were starved of food as a punishment, made to eat the same meal cold for hours until they finished it, or denied a meal altogether. Children who were locked alone in dark rooms or cupboards for some small fault. Children who were shamed and frightened and humiliated by the very person who, in the daytime, the parents praised so warmly to their friends. Take the famous and unsettling case of the writer Rudyard Kipling. He was sent as a small boy to live in a boarding house in England while his parents stayed in India. The woman in that house treated him with a level of bullying and emotional cruelty that he later wrote about with great pain. It is one of the harshest examples on record. Although that case is not strictly a nanny inside a family home, but within actual nurseries in respectable English houses there are quieter, similar stories. A child made to stand for hours, a child locked in for the afternoon, a child told again and again that they were wicked, ungrateful, that no one loved them, that they would come to a bad end. And the parents, 2 floors down, often did not know. Sometimes they knew a little, and chose, in the manner of their time, not to look too closely, because the household ran, and the children appeared at the children's hour in the evening washed and dressed and quiet, and that was thought to be what mattered. And sometimes the parents would not have believed the child if the child had tried to tell them, because the nanny was the trusted adult, and a small child crying about something the nanny had done was easily read by a busy Victorian father as simply being naughty about being disciplined. It was very hard from the bottom of that long staircase for a small voice to be heard. I want to be careful here, because I do not want to leave you with a wrong picture. The cruel Nanny was not, by any measure, the rule. She was the exception. But she was an exception that the entire arrangement of the wealthy Victorian household quietly made possible, and that is the truth that has to be told if we're going to tell this story honestly. Total power in a sealed room with almost no one watching is a thing that asks a great deal of the character of the person holding it. Most nannies were equal to the asking, some were not. The children who landed with the ones who were not had no real recourse at all, no one to turn to, no one to tell, and they would carry the marks of those years quietly, sometimes for the rest of their lives. It is one of the genuinely uncomfortable facts of the period, and it sits underneath all the cosier images of the warm firelit nursery, like a deeper note running under a softer melody. You do not have to listen for it all the time, but you have to know that it is there. And here is the part that, for me, makes it all even stranger to think about. Even in households where the nanny was strict in ways we would now call frightening, the children very often loved her anyway, deeply, genuinely, sometimes more than they loved their own parents, because she was still the one who was there. She was the one who knew them. She was the one whose face was the first they saw in the morning and the last they saw at night. A small child does not have a wide world of comparisons. The person who feeds you and dresses you and is there in the night when you are frightened is, by the logic of childhood, the centre of everything, almost regardless of how that person sometimes behaves. This is a hard truth about the human heart, and it is one of the reasons that for a great many adults raised in this system, the memory of the nursery was never simple. It was warmth and fear knotted together. It was love and dread in the same breath. It was the deepest comfort of their lives and sometimes the deepest small wounds, both delivered by the same hand. Let that sit for a moment. This is the shadow at the edge of the firelight. It is real. It is part of why the title of our story tonight uses the word dark. But it is not the whole of the picture, and it is not the heart of it. The heart of it, the real reason these women have stayed in the memories of the people they raised for 150 years, is something else entirely, something far gentler. And it is to that, finally, that we're about to turn. The morning has moved along. The cold wash is done. The breakfast is eaten. The lessons in the day nursery are quietly underway. Slates and small books on the scrubbed wooden table. The nanny moving from one child to another, listening to a small voice stumble through the letters, gently correcting, gently praising. The fire crackles. The rain finally has stopped, and the grey morning is giving way to a paler, kinder light at the small high window. In another hour or so, it will be time for the airing. Coats and bonnets and small boots, down the back stairs, out the back door, into the great green public park. On any given morning of the Victorian period, you would find rows of nannies in their dark dresses pushing perambulators along the gravel paths. The children of half the great houses of the city were out for their daily turn in the open air. We will go on that walk with them shortly because the park too has stories. But before we go outside, there is something I want you to feel. Inside this small high room with the firelight on the walls and the soft sound of children quietly working at their letters, there is a relationship taking shape that is not like any other relationship in the whole house. Not like the marriage in the bedroom below. Not like the friendship between the servants in the kitchen. Not even like the bond between the children and their own mother. It is something all its own. a bond formed in the small constant hours that no one downstairs ever truly sees, a bond made of carried water and brushed hair and cold flannels, and the same gentle voice every morning of every year. A bond a child does not even know they are forming, because at the time it simply feels like the world, and it is the strangest, most tender, most quietly powerful thing about this whole vanished corner of history. The fact that, very often, in a great Victorian house, the deepest love of a child's entire early life was given not to their mother and not to their father, but to a paid stranger who climbed the back stairs every morning to wake them. We have to talk about that. That is exactly where we are going next. Let me tell you something that might, at first, sound like it cannot possibly be true, but it is. It is one of the most thoroughly documented and emotionally complicated truths of wealthy Victorian childhood, and it explains almost everything about why this story still moves people more than a century later. In a great many upper-class and upper-middle-class Victorian households, the deepest, most powerful, most consuming love of a child's first years of life was not directed at their mother. It was directed at the nanny, not because the mother was cold, not because she was heartless or indifferent, not even in many cases because she did not love her children with her whole heart, but because love, in a small child, does not follow instruction or social theory. It follows presence, it follows constancy, it follows the face that is there. In this world she was the face that was always there, the face that came in the early dark and stayed until the very last good night. The voice in the night when a child woke frightened, the arms that lifted them when they fell, the patient hands that buttoned their coat and brushed their hair and wiped their tears. That face belonged to the nanny. Here is a number that I think helps make this real. In many wealthy households of the period, a child might see their mother for as little as 1 hour per day. 1 hour! And even that hour was not always guaranteed. It was called the children's hour. And it was one of the strangest rituals of the entire Victorian domestic world. Here is how it worked. Every afternoon, or sometimes in the early evening at a fixed hour, the nursery door would open and the children would be taken downstairs. They would be washed and freshly dressed, their hair brushed, their clothes changed from their everyday nursery things into something a little smarter, a little more presentable, and then they would be led down the staircase, out of their own world, and into the unfamiliar territory of the family rooms below, and they would be brought into the drawing room where their mother sat, perhaps with guests, perhaps alone, and they would be presented to her. Presented. That is the word that comes up again and again in the memoirs and the diaries of this period, and it is worth letting it settle, because it is a strange word to use about a child visiting its own mother in its own home. But that is exactly how it felt to many of the children who grew up this way. They were brought down, on display, to spend a measured portion of time with a woman they loved but did not really know, a woman whose rooms were beautiful and unfamiliar, a woman who smelled of perfume and wore soft clothes and spoke in a voice slightly different from the nanny's voice. This was a woman who kissed them and admired them and asked small polite questions about their lessons. After an hour, or sometimes less, the nanny would reappear in the doorway. The children would be taken back upstairs, back to the familiar rooms, the fire and the plain wooden table, back to the woman who actually knew what they had eaten for tea, whether they had been good, and what they were frightened of in the dark. I find that picture quietly devastating, and I want to be clear that the devastation runs in more than one direction. Because there is grief in it for the child, yes, who is being given the message, without anyone meaning to give it, that they belong upstairs and not down here, that their mother's world is not quite their world. But there is grief in it for the mother too, if you look carefully enough to find it, because many of these mothers did love their children. They were not monsters. They were not indifferent. They were women raised inside a system that told them with enormous confidence that this was the right and proper way to do things, that a good mother was a mother who employed a capable nanny and allowed that nanny to do her work without interference, that a woman who was always in the nursery, always fussing, always hovering, was in fact failing in her other duties, her social duties, her duties to her husband and her household. A woman of that class had a role to play in the world, and that role was not primarily the day-to-day raising of small children. That work belonged to the nurse, to the nanny, to the upper servants of the nursery. The mother's work was the household, the table, the social calendar, the running of a world. And in that division of labour, which felt entirely natural and right to the people living inside it, something very simple and very painful happened without anyone quite noticing. The children bonded to someone else, not on purpose, not out of rebellion, not because the mother had failed, but simply because love goes where presence is, and presence was upstairs, in the warm small room at the top of the house, and not in the beautiful drawing room where they were brought for an hour like visiting guests. Historians who study this period note that it was not unusual for a small child to genuinely believe, for a time, that mother simply meant nanny, and only later to realize that the word belonged to someone else entirely. When other children spoke about their mother, these children assumed they were talking about the same figure they meant, the one who was always there, the one who knew everything, the one whose lap was the safest place in the world. And when they eventually understood that their actual mother was the beautiful distant woman in the drawing room, and that Nanny was not their mother at all, it felt like learning a secret that made the world a smaller, colder, less certain place than it had been before. Think about that. And here is the thing that makes this even more complicated, even more layered, even harder to hold. The nanny knew it too. She knew that the child loved her more than it loved its own mother. She lived inside that knowledge every single day, and it was a knowledge she could never ever publicly acknowledge, because it was not her place, because those children were not hers, because the whole arrangement of that household rested on the polite fiction that the parents were the centre of the children's lives, and that she, the nanny, was merely the help, merely the hired hand who kept things ticking along smoothly until the family was ready to be together. And so she carried that love quietly. She received it, and she returned it, but she could never claim it. She could never say to the mother who came up once a day, "Your child loves me more than you, and we both know it, and there is nothing to be done about it." That truth lived in the nursery like an open secret that everyone could feel and no one was permitted to name. I find that one of the saddest truths in this whole story. A woman who is deeply loved by children she can never call her own. A mother who senses on some level that her child lights up more brightly for the nanny than for her. And a child in the middle, innocent of all of it, simply loving the person who is there, the way all children do, with no idea that this love is complicated or expensive or paid for by the hour. Now, there is a physical place in the house where all of this invisible tension was most keenly felt, and I want to take you there, because we've not left the nursery floor yet, and it is important that we do. The park, the daily airing. Every fine morning, and many a grey and drizzling one too, the nanny would dress the children in their outdoor things, coats and bonnets and small gloves and little buttoned boots, and she would take them out. Down the back stairs, out through the service entrance, or sometimes through the front door itself, depending on the household, and out into the streets, and along the pavement, and through the iron gates of the great public park. And here, on the gravel paths, under the bare trees in winter or the full green canopy in summer, was one of the most remarkable and peculiar gatherings of the Victorian day. Rows of nannies, walking in pairs or small groups, pushing their perambulators along the paths, the children toddling beside them or running ahead on the grass, and around these groups of nannies, a whole invisible social world of its own, as strict and as carefully graded as anything in the drawing rooms below. Because the nannies in the park had their own hierarchy, their own snobbery even. A nanny who worked for a titled family would not necessarily walk with a nanny who worked for a mere banker. The nanny of a household with 4 servants held herself a little above the nanny of a household with 2. They judged each other's charges, each other's perambulators, each other's dress and bearing, the smartness of the children's coats, the whiteness of the baby's bonnet. It was, in its way, a mirror of the adult world below, a shadow society, a parallel hierarchy played out on the paths of Kensington Gardens, or Hyde Park or Regent's Park, while the children ran and played and threw bread to the ducks with no idea that the women watching over them were silently measuring and being measured. And it was here, on those park benches, sitting beside other nannies while the children played, that the loneliness of the position sometimes showed itself most clearly. Because who does a nanny talk to? Not the family, not as an equal, not the servants below stairs, not comfortably, not her own family, who may be far away in the country, whom she sees perhaps once a year, if that. The other nannies in the park were often her closest thing to a social world, her community, her confidants, the only people who understood exactly what her life was like. And even they were competitors of a kind, rivals in the quiet contest of whose nursery was the best run, whose charges were the best behaved, whose employer was the most important. There is something in that loneliness, that walking endlessly through the park with other people's children and other nannies you can never quite fully trust, that I find genuinely hard to look at straight. It is a life built around love that is not quite yours, company that is not quite friendship, a world that is not quite home. But the children know none of this. They are running on the grass. They are feeding the ducks with crusts saved from nursery tea. They are watching the other children and the dogs and the carriages going by. They are holding the nanny's hand, the familiar hand, the safe hand, the one that means everything is all right and will continue to be all right. The afternoon is wide and grey and cool, and the whole park smells of damp earth and fallen leaves, and somewhere a church clock is striking the hour, and soon it will be time to go back. Back up the stairs, back to the nursery, back to the fire and the rug and the wooden table, back to the small warm world that, for these children, is the real world, the only world that truly counts. And the evening is coming now. The light is turning gold and then grey in the small high windows. The fire is built up for the last time. The nursery tea has been eaten, bread and butter and milk, and the long, slow ritual of the bedtime is beginning to gather round the edges of the room, like a familiar tide coming in. But before bed, there is one more journey to make. The last trip down the staircase. The children's hour, once more. The brief bright window in the drawing room where the mother waits in her evening dress. And the father, perhaps, is there too, home from his work, settling into his armchair with his paper, and the children will be brought in, shining and clean, and for a short time they will sit in this warm, unfamiliar, beautiful room and be loved by people they do not entirely know how to love back. And then the nanny will come for them, as she always does, and they will go with her willingly, even eagerly, back to the world that makes sense. This pattern, this daily rhythm of brief visits and long separations, shaped something deep in the emotional architecture of a whole generation of English children. It taught them, without anyone meaning to teach it, that love was something you could feel at a distance, that the people who mattered most were not always the people who were closest. That home was not necessarily where your parents were. Home was where Nanny was. That lesson, once learned, would echo forward through their entire lives. It bled into their marriages and their friendships. It showed in their own fumbling attempts years later to raise children differently, or sometimes to raise them in exactly the same way. They would hire their own nanny, climb their own stairs, and repeat the pattern, because it was the only shape of childhood they'd ever known. The children are in their beds now. The nanny has heard their prayers and tucked the blankets close and checked the guard around the fire one last time. She has said the same gentle good nights she says every evening. One child, the youngest, asked for water, and she brought it. Another child asked a question about tomorrow, and she answered it quietly. Then the room has gone still. The breathing has gone even. The day is done. She stands for a moment in the doorway of the night nursery, listening to them settle. Then she pulls the door almost closed. She leaves it open just a crack, the way she always does. The light from the day nursery falls in a thin, warm line across the floor. This way she can hear them if they call. And now, for the first time all day, she is alone. Truly alone. The children are asleep. The nursery maid has gone to her own bed. The house below is quiet, and she is sitting by the fire in the day nursery, in the only hour of the day that belongs entirely to her, with her sewing or her letter, or simply her own thoughts, and the silence of the house all around her. Who is this woman? Not what does she do? We have seen that now. But who is she? Where did she come from? How did someone end up in this life, this strange, devoted, solitary life at the top of a stranger's house? That question, and the answer to it, is where we are going next. Let us answer that question. Because the answer is not what you might think, and it changes the way you see everything in this room. When we picture a Victorian nanny, we tend to picture someone older, someone comfortable, grandmotherly, a woman who seems to have always been in the nursery, as permanent as the rocking horse or the fire guard. We imagine she was born to it. But that picture is an illusion. It is the way the children saw her, because children always see the adults around them as permanent. The historical reality is entirely different. Most nannies did not appear by magic in the upper floors of a London townhouse. They came from somewhere else. They came, overwhelmingly, from the country. Let me set the scene for you, because to understand the woman sitting by the fire, you have to understand the world she left behind. Not a great city, not a townhouse, a village, a small cluster of thatched cottages, perhaps in Dorset or Yorkshire or Somerset, surrounded by fields that looked beautiful in the summer and were bleak, freezing, and unforgiving in the winter. This was the world of the rural working class, the agricultural labourers. In the 1800s, an agricultural labourer's family was very often a large family. 6, 8, 10, sometimes 12 children, living in a cottage with 2 or 3 rooms, a dirt floor and a single hearth. Food was simple, and there was almost never quite enough of it. Bread, potatoes, a little bacon if they are lucky. A bad harvest, an illness, a harsh winter, Any of these could push a family from poverty into actual immediate hunger. And so, when a daughter in that cottage reached the age of 12 or 13, a decision was made. A decision that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with survival. She had to go out to work. She was a mouth to feed, and if she left, there would be slightly more bread for the younger ones who remained. That was the beginning of the road, not a calling to raise the children of the elite, a necessity. Think about that for a moment. The polished, capable woman sitting by the nursery fire tonight, the one who speaks with careful diction and knows exactly how to address a duke or a duchess if they visit the children's hour, began her life in a world so rough and so far removed from this one that it might as well have been another planet. She did not start as a nanny. You could not simply walk into a wealthy house and take charge of the children. You had to earn your way up the stairs. Her first job at 13 was likely as a scullery maid or a between maid in a minor country house, the lowest rung on the immense rigid ladder of Victorian service. Here is what that life actually looked like. She woke at 5 in the morning in the freezing dark. She hauled coal. She scrubbed the stone steps. She washed the heavy pots in the scullery until her hands cracked and bled from the harsh soda water. She was shouted at by the cook. She was ordered about by the upper housemaids. She was entirely invisible to the family who owned the house. She was simply a pair of hands, moving through the darkest, coldest parts of the building, doing the heaviest, dirtiest work. And she watched. That is how you survived in service. You watched the ones above you. If she was sharp, if she was clean, if she worked hard and kept her head down, she might be promoted, a housemaid, a parlour maid. And then, perhaps, if she showed an aptitude for it, if she had a quiet manner and a steady hand, she might be moved upstairs. She would become a nursery maid. We talked about the nursery maid earlier, the girl who hauls the water and scrubs the grate for the nanny. When our woman finally reached that position, she stepped into the nursery world for the first time. She was still doing the heavy work, but now she was doing it in the warm enclosed environment of the children's floor. And here she learned. She learned how to speak properly, dropping her thick country accent because a high-class Victorian family would not tolerate their children picking up the vowels of a farm labourer. She learned the complicated rules of middle-class and upper-class hygiene. She learned how to starch a collar, how to brew the nursery tea, how to coax a fretful toddler to sleep. She absorbed the entire invisible culture of the elite, not by being taught it, but by being immersed in it, and being punished if she got it wrong. Year by year, house by house, leaving one family for a slightly better position in another, gaining a written reference, building a reputation, moving from the country to a provincial town, and finally perhaps to London, until one day she is no longer the girl carrying the water. She is the woman giving the order. She is the nanny. I find that trajectory genuinely remarkable. A journey of social mobility that required almost unimaginable endurance, from a dirt floor cottage to the top floor of a Mayfair mansion. But here is the detail that I want you to really feel, not just understand intellectually. To make that journey, to hold that position, she had to pay a price that most of us would find unbearable. She had to surrender the right to a family of her own. Let me explain exactly what I mean by that. The rules of employment for a live-in nanny were absolute. She was a respectable woman in a respectable house, and her entire focus, her entire emotional reserve, belonged to her employer's children. She was to have no followers. That was the Victorian word for suitors. A man who came calling, a boyfriend. A nanny with a romantic life was a nanny who was distracted. And worse, In the deeply class-conscious and morally anxious Victorian mind, a female servant with a man visiting the back door was a potential scandal, a risk to the respectability of the house, so it was simply forbidden. If a nanny was discovered to be walking out with a man on her rare afternoon off, she could be dismissed. If she wanted to marry, she had to leave service. There were no married nannies living in with their husbands. The job demanded total, unshared devotion. And so, every young woman who worked her way up to this position faced a quiet, brutal choice. Leave the security, the warmth, the status, and the good food of the wealthy nursery to marry a working-class man, and return to the hard, uncertain, exhausting life of a labourer's wife, the very life she had spent 10 years escaping. Or stay in the warm nursery, keep the status, keep the respect, but accept that you will never have a husband, and you will never hold a baby that is biologically yours. Most of the women who became career nannies, the ones who stayed in the nursery for decades, chose the latter. I want you to sit with that choice for a moment. They chose other people's children. They poured their youth, their maternal instinct, their brightest and most energetic years into raising boys and girls who carried another man's name. They loved them. They comforted them in the night. They shaped their minds and their manners. And they did it all knowing that legally and practically those children could be taken from them at any moment. I find that simultaneously sensible from an economic standpoint and quietly devastating. Can I ask you something? Have you ever loved someone else's child? A niece? A nephew? A friend's baby? It is a wonderful feeling. You play with them, you hold them, and then, at the end of the day, you hand them back. The nanny did not hand them back at the end of the day. She kept them through the night. She kept them through the illnesses, the tantrums, the long rainy afternoons. She was their mother in every practical, emotional sense, except the one that society recognized. And that brings us to the most difficult part of this arrangement. The unspoken reality that hovered over the nursery fire every single evening. Children grow up. It is the great tragedy of parenting, even for biological parents. The baby becomes a toddler, the toddler becomes a child, the child pulls away. But for the nanny, this natural progression was not just a bittersweet emotional milestone, it was an existential threat. Because when the children grew up, the nanny was no longer needed. Picture the nursery, 5 or 6 years from the evening we are sitting in now. The oldest boy reaches the age of 8. In the wealthy Victorian family, 8 is the age of exile for a son. He is deemed too old for the soft, female-dominated world of the nursery. It is time to make a man of him. And so, the trunk is brought up. The nanny packs his clothes, the small shirts she has washed and ironed, the trousers, the books. She packs the trunk with a heavy heart, knowing exactly what is coming. He's sent away to boarding school, a preparatory school. The shock of that first departure is something the memoirs of the period dwell on heavily. A little boy, used to the firelight and the porridge, and the constant, steady love of his nanny, is suddenly thrust into a cold, strict, often brutal institution full of strange boys and harsh masters. Many of them wept for their nannies, wrote letters begging to come home to the nursery, and back in the house, the nanny reads those letters and weeps for him. But she can do nothing. He has crossed the border. He is out of her kingdom. She will see him only in the holidays now, and when he returns, he will be a little taller, a little harder, a little more distant. He will have learned that it is unmanly to sit on Nanny's lap. The bond, the fierce, perfect bond of the early years, begins to fray. Then, a few years later, it is the girls' turn. They do not go to school. They move downstairs to the schoolroom. They are handed over to the governess. The governess is a figure we must touch on, because she was the nanny's great rival. The governess was an educated woman, often a middle-class woman who had fallen on hard times. She taught French and history and the piano. She was socially superior to the nanny, and the household rules reflected it. The governess ate in her own room or with the family. The nanny ate in the nursery. When the girls moved to the schoolroom, the nanny lost them. She might still see them, might still brush their hair or help them dress. But the authority had shifted. She was no longer the centre of their universe. One by one, the beds in the night nursery are emptied. The rocking horse sits still in the corner. The guard around the fire is not needed quite as much. The room, once so full of noise and life and constant demanding motion, grows quiet. And the nanny, who has given 10 or 15 years of her life to this family, finds herself looking around a silent floor. What happened to her then? That story is waiting for you right on the other side of this moment. When the last child left the nursery, what became of the woman who had given them everything? In the very best of circumstances, in the wealthiest and kindest households, she was kept on. She became a kind of honoured pensioner within the house. She might be given a small room of her own, a permanent place by the fire, a small allowance. When the children she had raised grew up and had children of their own, she might be brought out to admire the new babies, a beloved relic of their own golden childhoods, addressed affectionately by everyone as Old Nanny. There is something genuinely beautiful in those stories, and they did happen. Winston Churchill, the great British Prime Minister, kept a portrait of his beloved nanny, Mrs. Everest, in his bedroom until the day he died. He paid for her headstone when she passed away. He loved her, and he never forgot her. But we must be honest, that was the exception. In most cases, a family did not want to pay the wages and the keep of a servant who no longer had a function. A wealthy house was a business, and when the nursery closed, the nanny's job was done. She was given a glowing written reference. She was given a small gift, perhaps a silver watch, or a framed photograph of the children she'd raised, and she was given her notice. She would pack her own trunk. She would walk down those back stairs, the ones she'd climbed 1,000 times with water and coal, for the final time. She would step out into the long, grey street. She was a woman in her 40s or 50s now. Her youth was spent. Her own biological family was long scattered. And she had to find another position, to start again, to walk into a new house with new strange children who didn't know her and didn't love her yet, and begin the whole long cycle of loving and losing all over again. Some nannies did this 3, 4, 5 times in a lifetime, raising a dozen children, leaving pieces of their heart in nurseries all over the country, until they were simply too old and too tired to carry the children or walk the park paths anymore. And then, the reality of the working-class life she had left behind at 13 came back to meet her. A nanny was paid a decent wage, but she was not paid a fortune, and much of her compensation had been her room and board. If she had not managed to save, and many sent their wages back to their struggling families in the country, an elderly nanny faced a very cold world. There were no state pensions for most of the Victorian era. There was no safety net. The workhouses of the late 19th century, the bleak punishing institutions built for the destitute, were not entirely empty of women who had once commanded the nurseries of Mayfair. I find that detail quietly heartbreaking. Not a sudden tragedy, just the slow, quiet tragedy of a woman who was essential until she was not. A woman who learned that love, when it is bound up in an economic transaction, has a hard boundary, but we do not need to leave her there. Not yet. Because the woman sitting by the fire in our nursery tonight is not old yet. The beds in the next room are still full. The children are still small, and they still need her, and tomorrow morning she will rise before the sun and coax the fire back to life, and draw the curtains, and say the same gentle words to wake them. She sits in the warm circle of the lamplight. She listens to the rain. She picks up her sewing. This is her life, lived entirely for others, in a room at the top of the stairs, suspended between the family she serves and the family she surrendered. Let that sit for a moment. The fire settles in the grate. The clock ticks on the mantelpiece. We are going to leave her to her quiet hour, because there is another part of the nursery world we have not yet explored, a part that comes with its own shadows and its own fierce devotions. What happened when those children fell ill? In a time before antibiotics, before vaccines, when a fever could turn fatal in a matter of hours, the nursery was not just a place of play. It was very often a hospital ward, and the nanny was the first line of defence against the terrifying diseases of the 19th century. That is exactly where we are headed next. Let us step into that part of the story, because it is impossible to talk about a Victorian childhood without talking about illness. Today, when a child catches a fever, we worry, of course. We take their temperature. We give them medicine that tastes like artificial cherries. We might call a doctor if it persists. But underneath our worry there is a flaw of modern confidence. We expect them to get better. In the Victorian era, that flaw did not exist. The 19th century was an age of terrifying, sudden and devastating childhood diseases. Measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough, diphtheria. These were not simply things a child caught and recovered from. They were the great reapers of the age. They moved through cities like invisible fires, sweeping through crowded slums and wealthy townhouses alike. Money could buy you a cleaner house, better food, and a doctor who wore a finer coat, but it could not buy you immunity. When the shadow of one of these diseases fell across a house, the entire structure of the household changed in an instant, and the person at the absolute centre of that change, the commander at the front line of the battle, was the nanny. Picture the nursery on the day the illness is discovered. It begins quietly. A child wakes up fretful. They push away their breakfast porridge. Their face is flushed, and when the nanny rests her hand against their forehead, a gesture she has made thousands of times, she feels the dry, terrifying heat of a real fever. Immediately the gears of the house begin to turn. The doctor is sent for, arriving in his carriage, climbing the back stairs with his black bag. He examines the child, listens to their chest, looks down their throat. And then, in the hushed quiet of the day nursery, he gives the verdict. It is scarlet fever. The moment those words are spoken, the nursery ceases to be a place of play. It becomes a quarantine ward. A sheet is hung over the nursery door and soaked in carbolic acid. A harsh, stinging disinfectant meant to catch the invisible miasma of the disease. The healthy children are rushed out of the house entirely, sent away to relatives in the country or to a seaside lodging to keep them safe, and the sick child is left behind, in the night nursery, behind the carbolic sheet, with the nanny. Here is a fact that I want you to sit with, because it reveals more about the reality of this world than almost any other detail. In many wealthy households, when a highly infectious and dangerous disease struck the nursery, the mother did not go in. Not always, of course. There were mothers who defied the doctors and their husbands to nurse their own children, risking their own lives to do it. But it was very, very common for the mother to be strictly forbidden from entering the sick room. She had other children to protect. She might be pregnant. She was the mistress of the house, and the doctor's orders were absolute. Keep away. So who stayed? Who sat in the chair by the bed as the fever climbed? The woman who was paid to be there, the nanny. I find that genuinely awe-inspiring. Not the performative kind of awe, but a quiet, profound respect. This woman, who had no biological tie to the child, who could have packed her trunk and fled the infection as many servants did, stayed. She stayed behind the carbolic sheet, breathing the infected air day after day, night after night. Let me paint you a picture of what those nights actually looked like. The room is dim. The fire is kept burning day and night because warmth was thought to be essential. The air is thick and it smells. It does not smell like the gentle, sleepy nursery we visited earlier. It smells of illness, and it smells of Victorian medicine. Eucalyptus oil steaming in a kettle over the fire, filling the room with its sharp medicinal vapour to help the child breathe. The sharp tang of mustard mixed into a paste and spread onto a cloth to make a mustard plaster, which was then laid against the child's chest to draw out the congestion. The harsh, clinical smell of the carbolic acid soaking the sheet at the door. And in the centre of it all, the bed and the child burning with fever. The nanny sits beside it. She's not sleeping. She might not have slept properly for 3 days. She wipes the child's face with a cool cloth. She coaxes a few drops of barley water or beef tea past their parched lips. When the delirium comes and the child cries out in the dark, she holds their hand and speaks in the low, steady, familiar voice that is the only thing tethering them to the waking world. This was not a matter of giving a pill and waiting. Victorian nursing was intensely physical, exhausting, moment-to-moment work. There was a concept in 19th century medicine called the crisis. It was the point in a severe fever where the disease reached its absolute peak. The doctors believed that at this exact moment, the body would either break the fever and begin to mend, or it would surrender, and the child would die. The crisis almost always seemed to come in the dead of night. Picture the nanny in that hour. It is 3 a.m. The house below is entirely silent. The doctor has gone home, having done all he can do. The parents are downstairs or perhaps in another wing of the house waiting. The rain is lashing against the small high window. The child in the bed is so hot they seem to radiate heat into the room. Their breathing is shallow and fast. The nanny sits forward. She watches the rise and fall of the small chest. She watches the clock ticking on the mantelpiece. She does not move. She does not look away. She's waiting for the sweat to break. She's waiting for the fever to crack. Can you imagine the weight of that silence? The sheer, terrifying intimacy of being the only conscious person in the room while a life hangs precisely in the balance. And then, if they are lucky, if they are very lucky, the breathing slows. The dry heat gives way to a sudden cooling sweat. The child opens their eyes, not wild with delirium now, but weak and clear, and looking for her. "Nanny?" And she leans over and she says, "I'm here." That was it. That was the victory. When a child survived an illness like that, something fundamental shifted in the room. The bond between the nanny and the child, already strong, was forged into something akin to iron. They had gone into the dark together, and they had come back out. To the child, the nanny was no longer just the person who gave them their porridge. She was the one who had saved them, and the parents downstairs knew it too. A nanny who pulled a precious air through a bout of diphtheria was elevated from a servant to a kind of household saint. Her position was suddenly untouchable. Her wages might be raised. Her requests in the nursery suddenly granted without question. But that is the story of survival. We have to look at the other side. Because in the Victorian era the crisis did not always break the right way. Sometimes the breathing did not slow down. Sometimes the fever simply kept climbing until the small body could not sustain it anymore. Infant and child mortality in the 19th century was a staggering, ever-present reality. Even in the wealthiest homes, the nursery was a place where children died. I want to be careful with this, because it is a heavy thing to ask you to picture. But we cannot understand the emotional life of the nanny if we do not understand what she lost. When a child died in the nursery, the grief of the family was, of course, absolute and devastating. But the family was allowed to grieve openly. They wore black. They received letters of condolence. They withdrew from society to mourn. The nanny's grief was different. It was the grief of a servant. She was the one who had to wash the small body for the final time. She was the one who had to pack away the clothes that would never be worn again, the toys that would never be played with. She had to fold the blankets. She had to strip the bed. She loved that child as fiercely as anyone in the house, sometimes more fiercely, because she was the one who'd spent every waking hour with them, but she was not family. When the funeral took place, she might be permitted to attend, but she stood at the back. She did not wear the heavy crepe veils of a mourning mother, and worst of all, she had to keep working. There were other children in the nursery, other beds that were still full. She had to dry her eyes, smooth her apron, and turn back to the surviving children, speaking to them in the same calm, steady voice, maintaining the routine, because the routine was what kept the nursery from falling apart. I find that quiet, unacknowledged sorrow to be one of the most haunting things about this history. To love a child entirely, to lose them, and to have no recognized right to mourn them. To carry the memory of their voice, the specific weight of them in your arms, and to lock it away behind a calm, capable face, because your job is to be the rock upon which the rest of the nursery stands. Think about that the next time you see an old photograph of a stern-faced Victorian nanny. We often mistake that sternness for coldness. I suspect in many cases it was not coldness at all. It was the careful, necessary armour of a woman who had survived the deepest kind of losses and had learned how to keep her heart intact. Let that sit for a moment. The shadow of illness was the darkest cloud that could pass over the nursery, but it was not the only dramatic shift that happened in those high rooms. When the children were well, when the fever had passed and the quarantine sheet was taken down, the business of childhood resumed. And the business of Victorian childhood, as the children grew slightly older, was not just play. It was improvement. It was education. And that brings us to another figure, one we touched on briefly before, but who now steps fully into the light. A figure who arrived with her own trunk, her own ideas, and her own profound threat to the nanny's absolute power. The governess. If the nursery was a kingdom, the arrival of the governess was a kind of quiet invasion. And the silent war that was fought between the nanny and the governess over the minds and hearts of the children is one of the most fascinating dramas of the Victorian house. That is exactly where we are heading next. Let us step into the schoolroom. To understand the conflict, you have to understand the geography. The nursery was usually the top floor. The schoolroom was often the floor just below it, and the staircase between them was a battlefield. When a little girl reached the age of perhaps 6 or 7, She did not go away to school like her brothers. She was educated at home, and for that the family hired a governess. The governess was a completely different creature from the nanny. The nanny, as we have seen, was working class. She was practical, she was maternal, she spoke with the grammar she had carefully learned by imitation, and her authority came from love and physical care. The governess was middle class. Very often she was the daughter of a clergyman or a merchant who had gone bankrupt. She was a lady who'd been forced by economic disaster to work for a living. She spoke French, she played the piano, she knew history and geography, she was educated, and she was technically the nanny's superior. When the governess arrived in the house, the dynamic of the children's lives fractured. Picture the scene. It is morning. The children have had their cold wash and their porridge in the nursery. The nanny has brushed their hair and made them neat. And then, at 9 o'clock, she has to hand them over. She walks them down the stairs to the schoolroom door, and the governess takes them in. For the next several hours the nanny is shut out. Inside the schoolroom, the governess is teaching them things the nanny does not know. The children are learning French verbs, they're reading poetry, they're playing scales on a slightly out-of-tune upright piano. And here is where the friction started. The governess looked down on the nanny. She saw her as an uneducated servant who indulged the children, who taught them superstitions, who let them speak with common accents, and who cared only about whether they had eaten their meat and not whether they had improved their minds. The nanny, in turn, deeply resented the governess. She saw her as an interloper, a cold, bookish woman who did not understand the children's real needs, who worked them too hard, who made them cry over spelling mistakes, and who had swooped in to steal the affections of the children the nanny had raised from birth. It was a clash of class, of education, and of maternal jealousy, and the children were caught perfectly in the middle. They spent their mornings with the governess, trying to be intellectual and proper, and then, when lessons were over, they fled back up the stairs to the nursery, back to the fire, back to the safe, unjudging arms of the nanny, where they didn't have to speak French, and where someone just wanted to know if they were warm enough. The memoirs of the period are full of this rivalry. Children describe the quiet, freezing politeness between the two women, the way the nanny would inspect a child returning from the schoolroom, muttering about how the governess had let them sit in a draft, the way the governess would correct a pronunciation the child had picked up from the nanny, making sure the child knew the nanny's way was common. It was a war fought with raised eyebrows, stiff postures, and passive-aggressive remarks about children's health. I find that deeply, magnificently petty, and also entirely understandable. Two women, both completely dependent on this family for their survival, both denied children of their own, forced to fight for authority and love over the same small group of boys and girls. But despite the education, despite the French verbs and the piano scales, when the dark came, when a child woke from a nightmare, when a knee was scraped or a heart was broken, they did not run to the schoolroom, they ran up the stairs. The governess had their minds, but the nanny kept their hearts, and that division between the intellectual life and the emotional life would stay with those children long after they left the house. They learned that love was not found in books, and it was not found in the drawing room with their parents. Love was found at the top of the stairs, smelling of coal smoke and warm flannel. Let that sit for a moment. The day in the nursery is long, and the years are longer, but they were not entirely spent in London townhouses or country estates. Once a year, the entire massive machinery of the Victorian upper-class childhood was packed into trunks, loaded onto railway carriages, and transported to an entirely different world, the seaside. and the logistical nightmare, the sheer chaotic theatre of moving a Victorian nursery to the beach for the summer, is something we simply have to see. That is where we are going next. Let us pack our trunks. Because every year, in the late summer, the entire polished, quiet, predictable world of the Victorian townhouse was deliberately broken apart. By August, London was a difficult place to be. The heat settled over the city, trapping the soot and the smoke from a million coal fires in a thick, stifling layer. The smell of the River Thames, which, for much of the period, was essentially an open sewer, became unbearable. Disease spread faster in the heat. And so, the wealthy families of the city did what wealthy families have always done. They left. They went to their country estates, or, increasingly as the century wore on, they went to the seaside. But going to the seaside in the 1880s was not a matter of tossing a few swimsuits into a bag and catching a flight. It was an undertaking of almost military scale, and the burden of that undertaking, the sheer, crushing logistical weight of moving the children, fell squarely on the shoulders of the nanny. Picture the day before the departure. The nursery is in chaos. The quiet, ordered rhythm has been shattered. The floor is covered in open trunks. The nursery maid is running up and down the stairs, bringing up more boxes and carrying down the ones that are full. The nanny is packing. And she is not just packing clothes, she is packing an entire environment. She packs the flannel petticoats and the linen smocks. She packs the sturdy walking boots and the Sunday shoes. But she also packs the specific nursery medicines. The eucalyptus, the mustard, the castor oil, because she does not trust the apothecary in a strange seaside town. She packs the children's favourite toys, sometimes even insisting that a particularly beloved rocking horse or large dollhouse make the journey. She packs special soaps. Sometimes she even packs a portable tin bath, because she cannot be certain the rented lodgings will have one suitable for the nursery. She's trying, essentially, to take the safety and the predictability of her top-floor kingdom and fold it into a series of wooden boxes. I find that level of responsibility quietly staggering. The parents were packing their own trunks downstairs, attended by their valets and ladies' maids. But if anything was forgotten for the children, if a specific medicine was needed in the night in a strange house and was not there, the blame would fall entirely on the woman kneeling by the trunk in the nursery. And then comes the morning of the journey. A fleet of cabs arrives at the door, the luggage is loaded, the children are dressed in their travelling clothes, which are heavy and dark so as not to show the soot of the railway journey. And they set off. For a Victorian child who spent most of their life looking at the same four walls and the same fireguard, the journey to the railway station must have been a profound sensory shock. The noise of the city streets, the massive, smoking iron architecture of the great London termini, Paddington, Victoria, Waterloo, the shrieking of the steam whistles, the hiss of the engines, the vast crowds of people pressing in on every side. Through all of this, the nanny moves like a sheepdog. She holds hands tightly. She watches the bags. She ushers the children into the first-class carriage, settles them on the plush upholstery, and pulls down the blinds to keep the soot from the engine out of their eyes. Can you imagine being that woman? Her own heart might be beating fast. She is, after all, a country girl who rarely leaves the top floor of the house. But she cannot show it. She has to be the anchor. She has to be the still point in the middle of all this terrifying, exciting noise. The train lurches forward. London falls away. The green countryside opens up outside the window, and eventually, after hours of travel, they smell it before they see it. The salt, the sea air, They have arrived at Brighton or Margate or Broadstairs, but the arrival is not the end of the work, it is merely the beginning of a different kind of work. The family has rented a house for the month, perhaps a tall terrace house facing the sea. And the very first thing the nanny has to do is secure her territory. She has to inspect the rooms assigned to the children. She has to figure out the stairs, locate the kitchen, negotiate with the unfamiliar servants of the rented house, and establish as quickly as humanly possible the routine. Because without the routine, a Victorian nursery falls apart. She demands that the children be given their plain food. She insists on the early bedtime, even if the sun is still shining brightly outside the window. She fights a quiet battle against the holiday atmosphere, because she knows that a child who is overexcited today is a child who will be weeping and exhausted tomorrow. And then there is the beach itself. We have to talk about the Victorian beach, because it is one of the strangest and most wonderful landscapes of the 19th century. It was not a place of relaxation in the way we understand it. It was loud, it was crowded. There were brass bands playing on the promenade, there were men selling whelks and oysters from carts, there were donkey rides on the sand, there was the high, squeaking voice of the Punch and Judy puppet shows drawing crowds of laughing children. And in the middle of all this joyful chaos, sitting on the sand, is the nanny. She is not relaxing, she is wearing her full uniform. Think about that for a moment. It is August. The sun is beating down on the shingle beach, and the nanny is sitting there in a heavy, dark, floor-length skirt, a long-sleeved blouse, a high collar, a corset, and a hat securely pinned to her hair. She sits straight-backed on a folding chair, or perhaps on a rug on the stones, keeping watch. She watches the children with a hawk's eye. She makes sure they do not wade too deep into the water, because the sea is dangerous and very few people in this era know how to swim. She makes sure they do not get too much sun, because a tanned face is the mark of an agricultural labourer, and wealthy children must remain fashionably pale. But most importantly, she watches to make sure they do not mix with the wrong children. The beach is a democratic place. The children of shopkeepers, the children of clerks, the children of the local fishermen are all running on the same sand. And the nanny's job, as the fierce guardian of her employer's social standing, is to ensure that her charges do not strike up a friendship or share a bucket and spade with a child who drops their H's or whose clothes are too shabby. I find that deeply uncomfortable and entirely true to the time. The snobbery of the Victorian class system was nowhere more fiercely policed than in the nursery, and the nanny, who was working class herself, was its most rigorous enforcer. She had learned the rules of the elite, and she applied them without mercy, pulling her children away from a game if she deemed the other children common. And yet, despite the heavy clothes, despite the rigid rules, despite the constant watching, the seaside was also a place of genuine magic. For the children, it was a month of freedom. They dug vast castles in the sand. They collected shells and smooth pieces of sea glass. They rode the donkeys up and down the beach, the nanny walking briskly alongside. And there was the sea bathing. This was not swimming. This was a medical procedure. The Victorians believed firmly in the health benefits of cold seawater. They believed the shock of the cold and the bracing quality of the salt fortified the constitution. And so, the children were taken down to the bathing machines. If you have never seen a picture of a Victorian bathing machine, you must look one up. It is a small wooden hut on wheels. The child, and perhaps the nanny, or a professional dipper, a strong local woman hired for the purpose, would step into the hut while it was on the dry sand. They would change out of their clothes and into their bathing costumes. And Victorian bathing costumes, even for children, were extraordinary garments. Made of heavy wool or serge, covering the body almost completely, they were designed to preserve modesty rather than to facilitate swimming. When wet, they weighed a ton. Once they were changed, a horse would be harnessed to the hut, and the whole wooden contraption would be dragged out into the water. The door facing the sea would open, and the child would be lowered, often protesting loudly, into the freezing waves. A quick dunk, a gasp for air, and then quickly back into the hut to be dried off and rubbed vigorously with a rough towel to restore the circulation. It sounds terrifying. For many children it was. But it was part of the ritual, another bracing dose of discomfort administered for their own good. And what about the nanny? Did she ever enjoy herself? I like to think she did, in the quiet moments. Perhaps early in the morning, before the crowds arrived, when she walked the children along the empty promenade and felt the sharp, clean sea wind against her face. She breathed air that did not taste of coal smoke. She watched the tide come in, vast and grey and powerful. For a woman whose entire life was bounded by the four walls of a London nursery, the sheer physical expanse of the sea must have been a profound relief. It is easy to imagine a nanny writing home in a quiet moment like this, complaining about small things, and then, almost as an afterthought, mentioning that she got to sit and watch the sea for an hour while the children dug in the sand. I find that thought quietly moving. A rare hour of rest stolen on a stony beach, while the children played safely at her feet. But the seaside holiday could not last forever. September comes. The wind turns colder. The rented house is packed up. The trunks are loaded once again. The train journey back is quieter. The children are browned by the wind, tired and a little sad. The nanny is counting the bags, mentally preparing herself for the massive task of unpacking and re-establishing the absolute rule of the London nursery. When they finally arrive back at the townhouse, they step through the door, and the house feels strangely dark and quiet after a month of bright sun and crashing waves. They climb the long back stairs. They open the nursery door. The fire has been lit to welcome them back. The rocking horse is waiting in the corner. They are home. The trunks are unpacked. The routine snaps back into place. The seaside becomes a memory, a collection of smooth stones lined up on the nursery mantelpiece. The autumn draws in. The days grow shorter. The gas lamps in the street are lit earlier and earlier. The thick yellow fog of the London winter begins to press against the glass, and the children sitting by the fire begin to look forward to the other great disruption of the nursery year. The only thing more exciting than the seaside: Christmas. But the Victorian Christmas in the nursery was a very different thing from the Christmas we celebrate today. It was a festival of sharp contrasts, of bright joy and quiet exclusion, and it reveals exactly where the children and the nanny truly stood in the hierarchy of the house. That is exactly where we are heading next. Let us return to the house, the townhouse in London. The year has turned. It is December. If you read the classic novels of the 19th century, Dickens especially, you have a very specific picture of a Victorian Christmas. You picture a massive roaring fire. You picture a dining table groaning under the weight of a goose, a plum pudding, and silver candlesticks. You picture a brilliantly lit drawing room with a large fir tree covered in wax candles and glass ornaments. And all of that was true. Downstairs. But we are not downstairs. We are at the top of the house. And the Victorian Christmas in the nursery was a completely different festival. The contrast between the two Christmases the adult one and the children's one, happening simultaneously under the exact same roof, is one of the clearest windows we have into the reality of this divided world. Let us look at the morning. The children wake up in the night nursery. It is freezing. The fire has not yet been lit, and the frost on the inside of the small window is thick enough to scratch with a fingernail. But they do not care about the cold, because it is Christmas, and at the end of their beds, hanging from the iron bedposts, are their stockings. These were not the bulging, overflowing stockings of a modern childhood. A wealthy Victorian child, whose father might earn thousands of pounds a year, received a stocking that was deliberately, carefully modest. There was an orange in the toe, a rare and brilliant splash of colour in the winter gloom. There were a few nuts, perhaps a shiny new penny, and one small, inexpensive toy, a wooden spinning top, a cloth doll, a tin whistle. That was it, and the children were thrilled. They sat in their beds in the freezing dark, peeling the orange, the sharp citrus smell filling the night nursery, while the nanny came in to light the fire. Why was it so modest? Because once again, the Victorians believed that indulging a child was morally dangerous. Too many toys, too much rich food would spoil them, make them ungrateful, and ruin their character. The grand wealth of the house was kept strictly away from the nursery floor. And what about the tree? There was no grand ceiling-height fir tree in the nursery. If the children had a tree upstairs at all, it was usually something the nanny had put together herself. A small branch, perhaps, brought up by the gardener, propped in a pot on the scrubbed wooden table. The children and the nanny would have spent the days leading up to Christmas making paper chains to hang on it, or tying small pieces of dried fruit to the twigs. It was humble. It was homemade. But here is the thing that I find genuinely moving. In the memoirs written by the people who grew up in these rooms, they almost never complain about the modesty of the nursery Christmas. They write about it with fierce, shining affection. They remember the smell of the orange. They remember the warmth of the fire. They remember the nanny smiling in the lamplight, giving them each a small gift she had bought with her own wages, perhaps a book of nursery rhymes or a new hair ribbon. Because the joy of the nursery Christmas was not in the things, it was in the intimacy. It was their own private festival, celebrated behind a closed door, safe from the cold, formal, complicated world of the adults. But they could not stay behind that door forever, because it is Christmas Day, and that means they must go downstairs. The Christmas visit to the drawing room was the most elaborate version of the children's hour of the entire year. The children were scrubbed until they shone. The girls were put into their best velvet dresses and stiff white pinafores. The boys were put into velvet suits with broad lace collars. The nanny brushed their hair, straightened their clothes, and gave them strict whispered instructions on the landing. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not touch the ornaments. Say thank you loudly and clearly. And then she led them down the long staircase, into the light. When the heavy mahogany door of the drawing room opened, the children stepped into a world that must have felt like a hallucination. The heat of the massive fires, the overwhelming smell of roasting meat and rich perfume, the room crowded with aunts, uncles, cousins and important guests, all dressed in rustling silk and heavy broadcloth. And in the centre of it all, the grand towering Christmas tree, glittering with real candles and silver foil. The children were paraded into the room. They were kissed by relatives they barely recognized. They were handed presents, often beautiful, expensive, educational presents chosen by their parents. Heavy leather-bound books, elaborate mechanical toys, and they stood there, holding these expensive things in their stiff velvet clothes, feeling entirely out of place in their own home. Can you imagine the strangeness of it? To be surrounded by your own biological family, your own parents, and to feel like a visitor from a foreign country. They looked at the grand tree. They ate a small piece of rich cake, which the nanny would later complain had upset their stomachs. They answered the polite questions. "Yes, Aunt Mary, I am doing very well with my French. Thank you, Uncle John, the book is beautiful." And all the while they were looking toward the door, looking for the familiar, steady figure standing just outside in the hall. Because the nanny did not come into the drawing room. It was not her place. She stood in the corridor, out of sight of the guests, waiting. And when the hour was up, when the parents gave the nod, she stepped into the doorway. The children said their formal good nights. They turned their backs on the glittering tree, the silver and the guests, and they went back up the stairs. They went back to the plain room, the small branch in the pot, the smell of coal smoke, and the woman who actually knew them. And they took off the stiff velvet clothes with profound relief, and put on their nightgowns, and sat by the nursery fire to eat their bread and milk. I find that contrast to be the perfect, heartbreaking summary of the whole Victorian arrangement. The wealth was downstairs, but the home was upstairs. And this cycle, the quiet months in the nursery, the seaside in summer, the sharp, bright contrast of Christmas, was the rhythmic heartbeat of a Victorian childhood. It repeated year after year, building the deep, unbreakable foundation of the children's lives. But childhood, even a Victorian one, is not a permanent state. The years pass, the bodies grow, and the absolute power of the nanny begins slowly and inevitably to erode. We touched on this briefly when we talked about the boys leaving for boarding school, but I want to show you what happened when those boys came back, because the return of a Victorian boy from preparatory school is one of the most jarring emotional shifts in the entire life of the house. Let us picture the nursery in the late December, a few years after the Christmas we just witnessed. The oldest boy, now 10 or 11, is home for the winter holidays. He is no longer the small child who wept when his trunk was packed. The boarding school system was specifically designed to strip away the softness of the nursery. He has been taught to be tough. He has been taught to play rugby, to endure cold dormitories, and to hide his emotions behind a wall of masculine stoicism. He has learned the fierce, often brutal hierarchy of older and younger boys, and now he brings that newly hardened self back up the back stairs and into the domain of the nanny. The clash is immediate. The nanny still sees the little boy she raised. She wants to check if he's wearing his warm flannel vest. She wants him to eat his porridge. She wants him to observe the strict, polite rules of the nursery table. But the boy has been living in a world where boys make the rules, or at least enforce them upon each other. He chafes at her authority. He uses schoolboy slang that she finds coarse and reprimands him for. He argues. He refuses to wear the scarf she knits for him. He makes noise that disturbs the younger children. There is a deep, quiet pain in these interactions, recorded in many letters and memoirs. The nanny, feeling her authority slipping away, becomes sharper, more critical. The boy, feeling embarrassed by her mothering, becomes dismissive. He begins to treat her not as the centre of his universe, but as what society tells him she is, a female servant. I want you to sit with the cruelty of that transition. She poured her youth into raising him, and his reward to her, mandated by the culture he's entering, is to outgrow her, to look down on her, to distance himself from the very warmth that kept him alive. He still loves her, underneath it all. When he is sick or genuinely frightened, the schoolboy bravado drops, and he wants his nanny. But in the daylight, he must perform his independence, and she must watch him do it, knowing that her job is exactly this, to make herself unnecessary. And what of the girls? The girls do not go to boarding school. Their transition out of the nursery is slower, but it is just as absolute, and in some ways it is even more complicated for the nanny to watch. As a girl reaches her teenage years, she's moving toward the single most important event in a wealthy Victorian woman's life, her presentation to society, her coming out. The nursery is long behind her now. She has been in the schoolroom with the governess for years, but as she turns 17 or 18, even the schoolroom is left behind. She is stepping into the drawing room, and the nanny, who may now be caring for a much younger sibling, or who may have been kept on as a household pensioner, watches from the upper landing. Picture the night of the girl's first major ball. The house is in a frenzy of preparation. The dressmaker has been coming for weeks. The girl is downstairs in her bedroom surrounded by maids, being laced into her first adult evening gown. It is a dress of white silk or tulle, the traditional colour of the debutante. Her hair is put up for the very first time, and the nanny is allowed to come down and see her. She stands in the doorway of the bedroom, her hands folded over her dark apron. She looks at the young woman in the white silk, the young woman whose grazed knees she bandaged, whose spelling words she heard, whose night terrors she soothed. The girl turns and smiles, asking, "How do I look, Nanny?" "You look beautiful, my dear," the nanny says. "Mind you stand up straight now." It is a moment of immense pride. The nanny's work is visibly complete. She's produced a refined, healthy, perfectly mannered young lady, ready to take her place in the upper ranks of the empire. But it is also a moment of final severance. When that girl walks down the stairs and out the front door to the carriage, she is entering a market, the marriage market. Within a year or two she will be engaged. She will marry a man of her own class. She will move into her own townhouse, and she will become the mistress of her own establishment. And what will she do when she has her first child? She will hire a nanny. She will interview a young, capable woman from the country. She will install her on the top floor. She will establish the routine. She will visit the nursery for an hour a day. She will repeat the pattern exactly as she learned it, because the Victorian world did not question its own structures. It merely replicated them, generation after generation. And the old nanny, watching from the landing, knows this. She knows that the cycle is beginning again, and that she is no longer the centre of it. The beds in her own night nursery are now permanently empty. The toys have been put away. The long, slow fade of the nanny's life has begun. This is the part of the history that the cheerful period dramas rarely show us. The aftermath, the quiet decades after the noise of the children has stopped. What did that life actually look like? Where did the devotion go when there was no one left to receive it on a daily basis? The answers are found in boxes of old letters, in wills, and in the quiet corners of Victorian graveyards. And that final chapter, the ultimate fate of the women who built the Victorian childhood, is exactly where we're going next. Let us open the door one last time. Because there is a day that every nanny knew was coming. From the very first morning she carried a baby into the room. A day that hovered at the edge of every seaside holiday and every Christmas morning. The day the nursery finally closed. It is a quiet, inevitable end. There is no sudden tragedy, no dramatic argument. It is simply the slow, relentless mathematics of time. The youngest child in the house, Perhaps a girl of 8 or 9 has outgrown the nursery floor. She's moving down to the schoolroom permanently. There are no more babies coming. The family is complete, the children are raised, and the great machinery of the top floor is suddenly, simply, no longer needed. Let us picture the room on that final day. The nanny is alone. Her job, her final duty to this family, is to dismantle the kingdom she's ruled for 15 or 20 years. She starts with the toys. Think about what it means to pack away a child's toys when that child is not dead, but simply grown. It is a very specific kind of ghost story. She picks up the wooden blocks. She gathers the tin soldiers that have fought 1,000 imaginary battles on the hearth rug. She finds the Noah's Ark that came out only on Sundays, the paint worn away on the edges of the wooden animals from years of being handled by small sticky fingers. She packs them into wooden crates. Some will be stored in the dark of the attic, waiting for a generation that will not be born for another 20 years. Some will be sent away to charity hospitals, to children who have never seen a painted wooden horse before. She covers the large doll's house with a heavy canvas dust sheet. She empties the cupboards. The small, heavy ceramic plates and the sturdy mugs they used for nursery tea are stacked and carried down the back stairs to the kitchen to be absorbed back into the general life of the house. The medicine bottles, the eucalyptus oil, the mustard powder, the castor oil, the very things she used to fight the terrors of the night and keep those children breathing, are simply thrown away. And then the fire guard, the tall, heavy wire screen that stood in front of the open coal fire. We have talked about this guard before. It was the absolute physical symbol of the nursery. It was the line between safety and danger that she had guarded every single day of her life. Now, a footman comes up the stairs. He unhooks the guard from the wall. He carries it away. Without the guard, the room suddenly looks different. It looks larger. It looks bare. It no longer looks like a nursery. It just looks like a room at the top of a house. I want you to sit with the silence of that room for a moment. For 15 years, this room has not been silent for a single waking hour. It has been filled with the sound of crying, of laughing, of the clatter of spoons on bowls, the rhythmic creaking of the rocking horse, the stumbling, hesitating recitation of the alphabet, the soft thud of small feet running across the rug, and now it is completely heavily silent. The nanny stands in the middle of the bare floorboards. What is she feeling in this exact moment? She is a professional. She has done her job, and she has done it perfectly. The children are healthy, they are well-mannered, and they are alive. In the harsh reality of the 19th century, where infant mortality was a scythe that swung through rich and poor alike, where so many children did not survive to see the schoolroom she has won, but her reward for winning is that she has to leave. She goes into a small adjoining room, the night nursery where she's slept for a decade and a half, with one ear always listening for a cry through the wall. She packs her own trunk. It does not take long. A Victorian servant did not accumulate a vast wardrobe. She folds the few plain dark dresses, the stark white aprons, the sensible boots, and then she packs her own small treasures, perhaps a tin biscuit box kept under the bed. Inside it are the keepsakes of a life lived entirely through other people's bloodlines. A lock of baby hair, pale and fine, tied with a faded ribbon. Crude drawing of a dog on a scrap of paper, handed to her proudly by a 4-year-old 10 years ago. A photograph of the children taken in the park, stiff and formal in their winter coats, looking solemnly at the camera. She closes the lid of the tin box. She locks her trunk. She puts on her coat and her hat. She walks down the back stairs. the stairs she has climbed tens of thousands of times. She knows exactly which step creaks, and she steps over it out of habit, even though it no longer matters if she wakes anyone. She goes to the master's study. This is the formal end of the employment. The father of the house, a man she has perhaps spoken to for less than 5 hours total, over the course of 15 years, is sitting behind a heavy mahogany desk. He hands her an envelope. Inside is her final month's wages. Perhaps if the family is generous, there is a small bonus. A £5 note to see her on her way. And there is the written reference, a sheet of thick paper that holds her entire future in its ink. Mary has been with us for 15 years. She is sober, honest, and entirely capable in the management of children. A few lines of polite Victorian script to summarize a decade and a half of total consuming devotion. There might be a small gift, a silver pocket watch, inscribed with her initials and the date, a token of esteem from a family that is entirely ready to move on without her, and then there is the final goodbye to the children. This is the moment that breaks the heart. Not because of what was said, but because of what was not allowed to be said. In the Victorian world, strong displays of emotion between servants and the family were considered highly improper. The nanny, who had wept tears of terror when these children were sick, could not break down weeping now in the front hall. The children, who are now trying very hard to be proper young ladies and gentlemen, who were learning the rigid emotional control of their class, were expected to keep a stiff upper lip. They stand in the hall. The polished floor gleams. The grandfather clock ticks. The nanny shakes the oldest boy's hand. He's tall now, awkward, wearing his school uniform. She perhaps allows herself to kiss the youngest girl's forehead, the girl who only a month ago was still sitting on her lap. She says, "Be good. Say your prayers. Remember what I taught you." "Yes, Nanny. Thank you, Nanny." And then the heavy front door is opened. Not the back door this time. As a mark of respect on her final day, she's allowed to leave through the front. She steps out onto the pavement. The door closes behind her with a solid, heavy final click. And she is entirely alone on the street. I find that moment almost impossible to fully comprehend. To have been the absolute centre of a world. To have been the most important person in a room, the beloved, indispensable, fiercely needed anchor of 6 lives. And then, with a click of a door, to be a middle-aged woman standing on the pavement with a trunk looking for a cab. Where did she go? We touched on this earlier, but we must look at it closely now, because the silence after the door closes is the most deafening part of her story. If she was lucky, if she was not too old, if she still had the strength for the carried water and the broken sleep, she went to an employment agency. She sat on a hard wooden bench in a waiting room. She presented her glowing reference to a new mother, a young woman perhaps 20 years her junior, who scrutinized her and asked if she was good with colicky babies. She was hired. She took a cab to a new house. She climbed a new set of stairs, steeper or shallower than the last ones, but always leading up. She unpacked her trunk in a new night nursery. She looked down at a new baby in a cradle, a baby who did not know her, whose parents she did not know, whose specific cries she had not yet learned to decipher, and she began the whole massive, exhausting, total commitment of love all over again. She would do it because she had to, because she needed the wages and the roof over her head. But she also did it because it was who she was. The nursery was the only world where she had power and status and love. She knew how to be a nanny. She did not know how to be anything else. Some women did this 3, 4, even 5 times in a lifetime. They raised 12 children, 15 children, none of them their own. They left pieces of their heart in nurseries all over London, all over the country, until they were simply too old and too tired to carry the children or walk the park paths anymore. And then, what happened to the ones who could no longer climb the stairs? Then, the reality of the working-class life she had left behind at 13 came back to meet her with terrifying speed. A nanny was paid a decent wage for a servant, but she was not paid a fortune, and much of her compensation has been her room, her board, her coal, her food. When the job ended, all of that vanished instantly. If she had not managed to save, and many sent large portions of their wages back to their struggling families in the country to support aging parents or younger siblings, an elderly nanny faced a very cold, very hard world. There were no state pensions for most of the Victorian era. There was no safety net, no social security, no retirement fund. You worked until you dropped, and if you could not work, you relied on charity or your family. But the nanny had given up her chance at a family to raise other people's children. She had no sons to take her in, no daughters to care for her in her old age. The workhouses of the late 19th century, the bleak, punishing, deliberately cruel institutions built for the destitute, were not entirely empty of women who had once commanded the nurseries of Mayfair. I find that detail quietly heartbreaking. Not a sudden tragedy, not a romantic death, just the slow, quiet tragedy of a woman who was essential until she was not. A woman who learned, in the hardest possible way, that love, when it is bound up in an economic transaction, has a hard and absolute boundary. She might rent a single room in a shabby boarding house in a poor part of the city. She might sit by a tiny smoking fire, rationing her coal, making a cup of weak tea, surrounded by the few things she had kept, the silver watch, the tin box of letters. The silence in that room must have been absolute. After a lifetime of the noise of children, the quiet of an impoverished old age must have felt like a physical weight pressing down on her. She would sit in the chair and she would wait. She would wait for the postman, because sometimes the postman brought a letter. And this brings us to the most complex and profound part of the entire Victorian childhood arrangement, the part that defies the simple narrative of cruel employers and discarded servants, because the children did not always forget. That is exactly where we are heading next, because the silence of the empty nursery and the silence of the boarding house room is not the end of the story. If it were, it would simply be a story of exploitation, a cold economic transaction with a tragic end. But history is rarely that simple, and the human heart is never that predictable. The children very often remembered. They remembered the woman who had carried the water. They remembered the woman who had sat by the fire when the fever spiked. They remembered the only person in their vast, wealthy, complicated world who had loved them simply because they were there. And when they grew up, when they left the house and entered the adult world, many of them did not leave that love behind. Let me tell you about one of them. His name was Winston. He was born into the absolute pinnacle of the British aristocracy. His grandfather was a duke. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a brilliant, volatile rising star in British politics. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was a dazzling American heiress, a socialite who spent her days organising political dinners and her evenings dancing at balls. They were glittering, fascinating people, and they had almost no time whatsoever for their son. Winston was a difficult child. He was stubborn, he was emotional, he struggled in school, and his parents, busy with their own brilliant lives, largely ignored him. But he had a nanny. Her name was Elizabeth Ann Everest, Winston called her Womany. For the first 20 years of his life, Elizabeth Everest was not just a servant to Winston Churchill. She was his entire emotional anchor. She was his mother, his confidant, his defender, and his safe harbour. When he was sent away to a harsh, brutal preparatory school called St. George's, where he was bullied and beaten, he wrote desperate letters home. His parents rarely visited him. His father thought he was a failure, but Mrs. Everest visited him. She sent him cakes. She sent him small amounts of money out of her own wages so he could buy sweets. She wrote to him constantly, telling him to be good, to wrap up warmly, and telling him, again and again, that she loved him. When he was sick, it was Mrs. Everest who came to nurse him. When he was lonely, it was Mrs. Everest he cried for. I want you to think about that. He was the man who would go on to become the Prime Minister of Great Britain, the man who would stand almost alone against fascism in 1940, the man whose voice would rally an entire empire during its darkest hour. Yet he was kept emotionally alive during his childhood by a woman from Chatham, Kent. A woman who spoke with a working-class accent and wore a plain dark dress. When Winston was 20 years old, a young cavalry officer just starting his military career, he received terrible news. Mrs. Everest was gravely ill. She'd contracted peritonitis. She was no longer working for the Churchill family. She'd been let go, cast off with a very small pension, when Winston and his brother outgrew the nursery. She was living in a small, modest house in North London. When Winston got the telegram, he did not hesitate. He dropped everything. He travelled through the night in the rain to reach her. He found her in her small room, fading fast. He sat by her bed. He held her hand. He stayed with her through the night, watching her breathe, just as she had watched him breathe when he was a sick child in the night nursery. When she died, his grief was absolute. He wrote in his memoirs years later that she had been my dearest and most intimate friend during the whole of the 20 years I had lived. When she was buried, it was Winston Churchill and his brother Jack who walked behind the coffin. They were the chief mourners. They paid for her headstone in the City of London cemetery, and Winston paid to have it maintained for the rest of his long life. But that is not the detail that I find the most quietly moving. Decades later, when Churchill was an old man, living at Chartwell, his beloved country house in Kent, the house where he painted, where he wrote his histories, where he gathered his family around him. If you go to Chartwell today and you walk into his private study, the room where he worked and thought and paced the floor, you will see a painting hanging on the wall. It is a small, quiet portrait, not of a king, not of a general. It is a portrait of Mrs. Everest. He kept her picture on the wall of his study until the day he died. The man who had shaped the 20th century needed the woman who had shaped him to be there, watching over him, just as she always had. I find that fact genuinely beautiful. It cuts right through the rigid class structures of the Victorian age and gets straight to the undeniable truth of the human heart. Love is not determined by who pays the wages. Love is determined by who shows up. And Mrs. Everest showed up. But Churchill was not an isolated case. This was a pattern that repeated itself across the length and breadth of the British Empire. Let me tell you another story. A quieter one. Robert Louis Stevenson, the author of Treasure Island, Kidnapped, and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He was one of the most famous and beloved writers of the 19th century. He was also, as a child, profoundly sick. He suffered from chronic, terrifying respiratory illnesses. He spent months of his childhood confined to his bed in Edinburgh, feverish, struggling for breath, unable to sleep, terrified of the dark and of his own coughing fits. His parents loved him, but they were not the ones who sat up with him. That was Alison Cunningham, his nurse. He called her Cummy. Cummy sat by his bed night after night, hour after hour. When the fever made him delirious, she read to him. She told him stories of Scottish history, of ghosts and smugglers and dark nights on the moors, of Covenanters hiding in the heather. These were the very stories, the exact cadence of storytelling that would later become the foundation of his world-famous novels. When he could not sleep, she would lift him out of bed, wrap him in a heavy woolen blanket and carry him to the window, pointing out the stars or the gas lamps on the street below to distract him from the pain in his chest. When Stevenson grew up, he travelled the world, eventually settling in the South Seas in Samoa, far away from the cold damp of Scotland. But he never forgot the woman who had kept him alive. When he published A Child's Garden of Verses, his most famous collection of poetry about childhood, he did not dedicate it to his mother or his father. He dedicated it to Cummy. The dedication is a poem itself, and the last lines of it read, "From the sick child, now well and old, take, nurse, the little book you hold, and grant it, heaven, that all who read may find as dear a nurse at need, and every child who lists my rhyme in the bright fireside nursery clime may hear it in as kind a voice as made my childish days rejoice." He sent her a copy of the book bound in fine leather, and she kept it, her most treasured possession, until she died. I want you to think about what that means. The literature of the 19th century, the political landscape of the 20th century, the maps of the empire. All of these things were shaped by men who had been formed in the quiet, enclosed world of the nursery. There is a fascinating psychological truth here, one that historians and biographers have spent decades trying to untangle. The men who ran the British Empire, the viceroys, the governors, the generals, the politicians, were famous for their emotional restraint. They were taught at their boarding schools to show no weakness, to hide their tears, to present a completely hardened exterior to the world. They were men who could send thousands of soldiers into battle without flinching. They could govern millions of people with icy, aristocratic detachment. But many of them had one weak spot, one place where the armour cracked, and that place was the memory of their nanny. Lord Curzon, the formidable and famously arrogant Viceroy of India, a man who believed himself to be the absolute pinnacle of British superiority, burst into tears in front of his staff when he received a telegram informing him that his old nanny had passed away. He wept for her in a way he had not wept for his own parents. Why? Because she was the only person in his entire life who'd allowed him to be weak. In the drawing room, he had to perform for his parents. At school, he had to fight to survive. In politics, he had to project absolute power. But in the nursery, he had just been a little boy. And the nanny had loved him precisely when he was weak, when he was sick, when he was frightened, when he'd scraped his knee and was crying on the rug. She did not demand that he be a viceroy. She just demanded that he eat his porridge and wash his hands. For men who spent their adult lives carrying the crushing weight of imperial responsibility and social expectation, the memory of the nanny was the memory of the only unconditional, uncomplicated love they had ever known. She was the mother they were actually allowed to have. And what about the nannies themselves? What did they make of all this? They knew exactly how important they were. Even if society told them they were just servants, even if they were dismissed with a cold reference when the children grew up, The women themselves knew the truth of what they had built. We know this because of what they kept. When an elderly Victorian nanny died in her rented room or in the ward of a hospital, the people clearing out her few possessions almost always found the same thing: a tin box, or a small wooden chest, or a tied bundle of letters. Inside, carefully preserved, were the records of her life's work. Not bank statements, not property deeds. Letters. Letters written on thick, expensive paper, bearing the crests of noble houses or the addresses of government ministries, written by grown men and women, addressing her as "Dearest Nanny" or "My darling old nurse." Letters telling her about their marriages. Letters telling her about the birth of their own children. Letters sending her a £5 note for Christmas, begging her to buy herself something warm for the winter. There would be photographs, faded sepia portraits of serious-looking children in velvet suits, and then later photographs of those same children as young officers in uniform, or young women in wedding dresses, always with a note inscribed on the back, "To Nanny, with all my love." There would be the small, worthless treasures of the nursery, a shell picked up on the beach at Margate 30 years ago, a crude drawing, a lock of hair. This was her archive, this was her proof. Society might have seen her as a spinster, a woman who had failed to marry, who had failed to have a family of her own, who had lived on the margins of other people's lives and died with very little money to her name. But the tin box told the truth. She had not failed to have a family. She had raised half a dozen of them. She had poured her life into the foundation of other lives, and those lives had held. She had been genuinely, entirely, irrevocably necessary to the people she loved, in the quiet, lonely years of her old age. Those letters were the fire she sat by. They were the evidence that her life had meant something, that the carried water, the cold mornings, the sleepless nights of the fever watches, the endless walks in the park, the battles with the governess, the packing and unpacking of the trunks, all of it had mattered. She had built the people who built the world, and she had done it from a small, plain room at the very top of the stairs. Let that sit for a moment. I find that to be one of the most quietly triumphant facts of the entire period. The absolute resilience of love against a system designed to treat it as a commodity. They bought her time, they bought her labour, but they could not control where the children's hearts went. The hearts went to the woman who was there. The night is getting very late now. We have climbed the stairs. We have sat by the fire. We have walked in the park and stood by the sea. We have seen the nursery in the bright morning and in the terrifying dark. We have watched the children grow, and we've watched the woman who raised them fade quietly into the margins of history. It is a long story, full of shadows, but I hope you can see now why it is a story worth telling. Because underneath the rigid rules and the harsh realities, it is simply a story about the profound, world-shaping power of someone just showing up day after day and being kind. And now it is time for us to leave. The fire in our nursery has burned down to the last dull red embers. The coals are shifting slightly as they cool, making that soft, familiar clicking sound in the grate. The clock is ticking softly on the mantelpiece, measuring out the final quiet hour before the dawn. Outside, the rain has finally stopped. The city is completely still. It is time to leave the room. We will step softly, so we do not wake the children in the night nursery. They're sleeping deeply now. They're breathing slow and even in the dark. We will let the nanny sit in her chair by the dying fire. Let her have her quiet hour. Her work is done for today. Tomorrow she will rise before the sun, but for now she is at rest. We will walk down the long, narrow back stairs, past the schoolroom, past the grand silent bedrooms of the parents, down, down, through the sleeping house. We will open the heavy front door. We step out into the cool, damp night air. The street lamps are glowing faintly in the mist. We close the door behind us. A solid, quiet click, and we leave the 19th century behind. Thank you for coming on this long journey with me tonight. If this story brought you a little comfort, or made the world feel a little softer, or simply gave your mind a quiet place to rest, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It is the small, quiet gesture that allows me to keep making these long, calm trips into history for you. And if you're still awake, and it is perfectly wonderful if you are not, drop a comment below. Tell me, what was the detail tonight that you will remember tomorrow? Was it the cold wash, the orange in the stocking, or the tin box of letters under the bed? I read every single one. But now it is time to let it all go. Let the screen go dark. Let the room around you go completely quiet. Let your mind drift away from the gaslight and the tall houses and the strict rules of the past. Let it all dissolve into the soft, heavy comfort of your own bed. The day is done. The fire is banked. There's nothing left to carry. Follow the children into sleep. Good night, friend.